Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Iceberg Live, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us here on YouTube at Tip of the Iceberg or anywhere you get your podcasts from. I only have one topic to go into today, but it's a big topic that we need to get into, considering it has been almost a full calendar month since the contract extension for Alex Nedeljkovic. Where does that leave Tristan Jarry? We talked about it back then, saying that it could mean the end for Tristan Jarry in Pittsburgh. And since then, all has been quiet on the goaltender front in Pittsburgh. We'll talk about the Penguins' most likely scenario when it comes to the goaltending position, and then also touch on where he could potentially go if he ends up being on the trade block. And then, of course, we'll close out the show the way that we close out every single show here live on Tip of the Iceberg on YouTube by answering all of your questions. So if you're in the comment section, make sure you drop your questions here, and we'll try to get to every single one of them before we say goodbye today. But let's start off with the main topic of conversation today, because the title of the show is Trade is Still on the Table for the Penguins and Tristan Jarry. And I think that is going to remain the case really all season long. And the reason I want to bring this up is because it feels more and more like the most likely scenario for the Pittsburgh Penguins when it comes to the goaltending situation is an in-season trade. That's where I'm at this point. It's where I'm probably going to stay at going forward until something else drastically changes for the Pittsburgh Penguins. It looks like they're likely to enter the season with the same tandem that they finished with last year, which was Tristan Jarry and Alex Nedeljkovic. And we saw what happened at the tail end of last year. Tristan Jarry, who was supposed to be your bona fide number one goaltender, not just last year, but going into the future. Instead, it's Alex Nedeljkovic that ends up being your starter for the last 13 games of the season. Tristan Jarry unable to wrestle the net back from Nedeljkovic. And we all had the same question. What happens in the offseason now? Because do they trust Tristan Jarry to be a starter going into the future? He still has several years left on that contract that he just signed a year prior, and Alex Nedeljkovic was in need of a new one. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, Nedeljkovic gets a new contract. You go into next year at this point, considering a lot of the hockey moves have happened, a lot of the goaltending moves have already happened. It looks like you're going into next season with Jarry and Nedeljkovic. And I think the one thing that they're going to count on is that Joel Blomqvist continues to grow until he's NHL ready. And they're hoping that Joel Blomqvist becomes NHL ready towards the beginning of next season, maybe a month or two in the minors to continue conditioning, to continue to build, and to show that last year was not a fluke and that he can continue the progression positively on his development to potentially get an opportunity at some point this season. And at that point, the other thing you're hoping for is Tristan Jarry to have a stellar start, which is something that, honestly, he's been prone to do. You look at what Tristan Jarry's numbers are between October and December throughout his career. He has a 59, 30, and 13 record, a 922 save percentage, a 2.36 goals against average, and 12 of his 19 career shutouts between the months of October and December. We all know the story after that, right? New Year's Day comes, New Year's Day goes, and so too does the most productive version of Tristan Jarry. He folds under pressure seemingly, and when the lights get brighter and when the games get more important, he just has not been able to step up and stand up to the challenge. And at this point, it's getting to the fact that the Penguins need to move on. The question is, can they? Who's on the other side of it? We'll get to it in a second, but that's what to me feels like the most likely scenario for the Pittsburgh Penguins going into the season. They're going to rock with Jarry and Nedeljkovic. They're going to hope Jarry has a really stellar start to the season. They're going to hope Blomqvist has a stellar start to the season as well. And then they're going to trade Jarry if possible, if a suitor comes along, for as much as they possibly can, selling high on a guy that has been so volatile over his entire NHL career that you just don't know whenever he's going to fall off the edge of the earth. I mean, you can say it's January 1st, but everybody else is going to see that as well. So you're hoping that that's what the case is for the Penguins. They get some good value in return for Jarry. They get salary cap space opened up going into the next couple of seasons, and they have a clean slate in the goaltending position. And for them, best case scenario is Joel Blomqvist comes up, gets some seasoning early in the year, gets the opportunity late in the year, and all of a sudden you have a cheap goaltender and you have a decent backup in Alex Nedeljkovic, or a 1B and Alex Nedeljkovic with a young pairing with Joel Blomqvist. And then, of course, as we've talked about last week, you have Sergei Murashev, who was a couple years out, but still looks to be a very dynamic goaltender and a very stellar goaltending prospect for the Pittsburgh Penguins. So that's the most likely scenario for the Penguins, is an in-season trade of Tristan Jarry. I think it's still on the table. I think when you're looking at the Pens next year, they're hoping to get the most out of the players they have on the roster, but they're going to be open to a lot of trades throughout the entirety of the season. So I'm intrigued to see, what Jarry has to say when he shows up at training camp, because obviously there's been a lot of talk throughout this offseason, as there has been the last 2 off seasons about him. So I'm excited to see what he has to say and how he responds early in training camp and early in the season. Now, as far as where he could land, the best landing spots for Tristan Jarry, Bleacher Report's Adam Gretz put out a piece earlier today, and it's linked in the description below, about the 4 best landing spots for Tristan Jarry. And this is what he had to say about the fact of trading Jarry to begin with. Quote, with UC Soros re-signed in Nashville and several other goaltenders, i.e. Jacob Markstrom, Logan Thompson, already changing teams this offseason, there aren't many options available in the free agent market or trade market. Teams that are still looking to make a change or look for an upgrade in goal could circle back to Jarry. And he names 4 teams. The one that I want to highlight here, and I'm not going to highlight all of them because I'm not going to give away his entire article. Go check it out if you want to know all 4 teams. The one team that he mentioned that, to me, is very intriguing is the Utah Hockey Club. I mean, that is a team that, as Gretz points out, completely restructured their defense. Looks like they're trying to break free of the ever-long rebuild that the Arizona Coyotes were going through, and they want to give their fans some excitement in their first year in Salt Lake City. So you look at what they did adding Sergachev. You look at what they did bringing in John Marino, former Penguin. They also brought in Ian Cole, former Penguin, and they have a lot of young talent between, the young Doan kid, the Logan Coolies of the world. They also just brought in Tija Ginla. We'll see where he starts the season. But there's a lot of exciting talent in Utah's system right now, and a lot of exciting young talent that is going to be playing at the NHL level for Utah. They need a goaltender. And if they get into the season and they start off hotter than they expect, and they start off to look like a team that could vie for a playoff spot, or at the very least be a bubble team for a playoff spot, and they want a goaltender, that's where Tristan Jarry fits perfectly. They have plenty of salary cap space. Their window has not opened yet. They might want to bounce out of the rebuild. They might want to try to push for a playoff spot, but they're not in their contention window. That's a couple years down the road. So they can buy now on a short-term goaltending prospect or project in Tristan Jarry. And I think that is a perfect answer for the Pittsburgh Penguins, because that's the one where you're least likely to have to retain salary, which we know Kyle Dubas does not want to do. And if you look at what they have, in return, they have a good bit of draft capital because they haven't been going for it for the last several years, which means they've been able to stockpile that. And the Penguins, that's something that they're looking to do over the next couple of seasons. So shout out to Adam Gretz for a solid piece, stellar piece there. 4 landing spots for Tristan Jarry. I like the Utah Hockey Club as a potential landing spot. The only thing I disagree with is I feel like this is going to get into the season. I think the most likely scenario is a trade-in season. Does that rule out the capability and the potential of a trade to happen during the offseason? No. I think there's still a slim chance that happens, and there's also a slim chance that the Penguins just say, all right, nothing is worth it. Nobody is offering anything that is close to being worth it. We're just going to ride it out with Tristan Jarry and Alex Nedeljkovic and see if they can build on what they did last year and see if Tristan Jarry can, finally find his game in the second half of the season. But I think the most likely scenario for the Penguins is that in-season trade for Tristan Jarry. Before we move on, I want to know your opinion. Drop it in the comment section here. Do you think that an in-season trade seems to be the direction that the Pittsburgh Penguins are going to go? Because to me, if I'm going to put a percentage on it, which I know that's a fool's errand, if I'm putting a percentage on it, I think there's at least a 60% chance that ends up being the route that they go, with the remaining 40% being split between trading them this offseason, waiting out the year next year, maybe trading them next offseason, or just hanging on to them and hoping for the best. I know they're a rebuilding team, so potentially they don't really, care if they end up missing the playoffs again. I know that they like to, but if you're Kyle Dubas, if you can get anything out of Tristan Jarry and get his contract off the books, I think that is a great move for him. Let's move over and answer some of your questions here, because it is the middle of July. It is 100 degrees outside, and it has been 100 degrees outside seemingly for the past month, at least in the DMV. So I want to move on over and talk about what you guys want to talk about and then get into the questions that you guys have this Wednesday. Let's start with Pittsburgh fan 412. Says, is there a deadline for a decision about where Murashov will play this season? He did mention yet last week, Sergei Murashov at Prospect Development Camp, that he needs to make a decision in the next couple of weeks. And I think that's what you need to know. He obviously needs to know, and the Penguins need to know if they should expect him at training camp. It was a surprise that he showed up to Prospect Development Camp. Certainly a pleasant surprise, but a surprise nonetheless. I think you're going to see that decision be made here in the next couple of weeks. There's no exact deadline, but he's going to want to know where he's playing. The Penguins obviously need to get the visa situation figured out for Sergei Murashov, and they'd like to know if they're going to have that goaltender going into the year, not just at training camp, but think about what that does at the American Hockey League level, because you already have Joel Blomqvist, who you're hoping makes a vast majority of the starts. Now you're going to be splitting the net between him and Sergei Murashov, and you can send him down to the ECHL, but something tells me that Sergei Murashov is probably a little bit more advanced than the ECHL has to offer, and I think that if that was the case, if he was going to end up playing in the East Coast League, he would just stay in Russia and play in the MHL and potentially play in the KHL as well. So I think that decision, Pittsburgh fan, it has got to come here in the next couple of weeks. There's no hard deadline. I guess you could say the hard deadline is the opening of training camp, but I would imagine that the Penguins want to know that answer sooner rather than later, and probably in the next couple of weeks. Peter Swisstock wants to know, which notable prospects will play in the AHL this season who didn't play there last season? The two big ones, and one of them did play there last season. One of them played just in the playoffs last season. But the two big ones are going to be forwards Vasily Ponomarev and Ville Koivunen. Koivunen came over from Finland. He played in the playoffs, scored a goal and an assist in 2 games. So he's going to be over to start the season. He's also going to be able to vie for a potential roster spot at Penguins training camp. And the same goes for Vasily Ponomarev, who came over in the trade, immediately went to the American Hockey League and played for the Wilkes-Barre Penguins before being injured and ending his season on IR. So those two are notable. The other notable name, one guy turning pro, is 2022. I got to get my years straight. 2022 first round pick. It is 2022 first round pick. I got to get it. Owen Pickering will be turning pro this year, making his debut in, Wilkes-Barre Scranton as a full-time AHLer. He's played at the end of the WHL season a couple times. He's come over to Pennsylvania and gotten some work in the AHL level, gotten on some tryout basis at the AHL level, but he will be a full-time professional this year. So Owen Pickering and also Tristan Brose, last year NCAA national champion, 2 overtime goals in the lead up to that national championship for the University of Denver. He will be at the AHL level as well to start this season. So a lot of young guys going to the American Hockey League to start the year should be very entertaining, because a lot of the top prospects for the Penguins are going to be not just starting at the AHL, but being given opportunities potentially throughout the year to make their NHL debuts, or if they already have, to make a little bit more of a name for themselves at the National Hockey League level. Let's run down through here and ask some more questions, or answer some more questions here. Let's start with Zach DeRosa, who says, do you take a chance on Karel Vejmelka? Always liked him. Vejmelka, obviously, of the Utah Hockey Club. We talked about Utah being a potential landing spot for Tristan Jarry, and the reason is because Tristan Jarry, let's face it, as of right now, is still a better option than Karel Vejmelka. Vejmelka has never finished a season above 900. He does have that capability to go on a couple of runs and play above his skis, but I see him similar to the way that I see an Alex Nedeljkovic, a guy that is going to, for the most part, be a backup, potentially a 1B for you in certain situations, and he might be able to, if he gets hot, be good enough to go on a run where you win for 2 weeks straight with him behind you, and he gives you the great chances to win, holding opponents down to 2 or 1 goals. But I don't think Vejmelka is an answer for the future, and I think that more so they already have a guy like Karel Vejmelka and Alex Nedeljkovic. So I understand it. Last year we were talking about him as a potential option to back up Tristan Jarry in Pittsburgh via trade. I don't think that he's an option for the Penguins going into this season, unless, of course, the Utah Hockey Club need to send a goalie back the other way. Then the Penguins can bring him in especially if Joel Blomqvist isn't ready by, say, December or January, like I laid out in that earlier instance. Mickey wants to know, how do you think Grzelcyk will fit in with the Pittsburgh Penguins? It's going to be interesting for Matt Grzelcyk because he was brought in a clear, this is a rebuild type of signing, right? You look at Matt Grzelcyk, he had a rough couple of years under Jim Montgomery with the Boston Bruins last year and the year prior. He's looking for a fresh start with Pittsburgh. He's a guy that, as I said several times, has cut his teeth in this league being a top pairing guy playing with Charlie McAvoy. So can he play with Chris Letang? That's going to be the question. I think that's where he slots in. I think that's where the Penguins want him to play because I think they want to see Ryan Graves start the season on the third pairing alongside Jack St. Ivany. So how is he going to fit in? I mean, this is a guy that has played heavy workload, heavy minutes before in his career, and I think that's where he's going to fit in with the Pittsburgh Penguins. You look around, obviously they brought in Sebastian Aho, who might be able to get some time in the lineup, but I think Grzelcyk's going to be the guy that gets that first fit. And as far as how he fits playing with a guy like Chris Letang, I think if you see the Chris Letang that we saw early last season, it's going to be a good pairing for Matt Grzelcyk, because the Chris Letang of early last season, people aren't going to want to hear this and people aren't going to agree with this because we're so far removed and people already have this ability to go back and just ignore everything that Chris Letang did positively. But at the beginning of last season, he was very good defensively. He was tasked with a different role. Erik Karlsson was the power play one guy. Erik Karlsson was the, bulk majority of the offensive zone face-off guy. He was the guy that goes with Crosby the majority of the time. So Letang had to take a back seat and he had to kind of change his game. Early in the season, he did that at a very high level. If he's able to get back to that, and obviously health is going to be a major factor for Chris Letang going into the season, and if he's able to go into this season healthy and start off the way he started off last year, I could see Matt Grzelcyk fitting really well on that second pairing with Chris Letang, and your top pairing being Marcus Pettersson and Erik Karlsson. So that's how I think he'll fit. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see. It's been a couple of pretty bad years. Everybody wants to point out the fact that he was a healthy scratch during the postseason, during the majority of the games for the Boston Bruins for, I think, Wotherspoon. I don't remember his first name. I want to say it was Spencer. But, things just didn't work. And you can go back to a specific point where things started going in the wrong direction. It was due to a couple injuries. It was also right at the change of Bruce Cassidy to Jim Montgomery. So we'll see if a new regime, a new coaching staff helps out Matt Grzelcyk. I'm certainly keeping my eye on him as one of the guys that, if he pans out, and again, the Penguins are in a weird situation. They don't want to call it a rebuild. I'm calling it a rebuild. We need to label this somehow. The Penguins are in a weird situation where, yes, they would like to see this team outperform expectations, make it to the postseason, and make a little bit of noise. But at the same time, if Matt Grzelcyk goes off, he's 30 years old, he's on a one-year contract. If somebody else needs a left-shot defenseman to play in their top four and Grzelcyk is performing well, is he going to end up on the trade block anyway? Is he going to end up being traded in return for a second-round pick, a third-round pick at the trade deadline? That's going to be one of the biggest storylines throughout this season to watch, especially considering the Pittsburgh Penguins are in that weird situation when it comes to their rebuild. Christopher says, who would we get to replace Jarry on the short term? And I mentioned it earlier. I think that it's literally trade Jarry if you're ready to hand the keys over to a certain extent to Joel Blomqvist. I think they have a lot of faith in Alex Nedeljkovic, and he showed you late last season, while he didn't take the world by fire, he didn't go out there and shut every single team out. He played for 2.5 weeks straight against some of the best competition the Eastern Conference has to offer. And the Penguins were, by and large, one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference down the stretch last season. They fell short, and that's due to the fact that prior to that stretch, they were abysmal for certain stretches, especially the one that led up to the trade deadline and the couple of games following the trade deadline. But you saw Alex Nedeljkovic be able to carry a team for a couple of weeks. And if Joel Blomqvist continues, and again, this is not 2 weeks of Joel Blomqvist looking good at the AHL level. This is 1 to 2 to potentially 3 months of him looking like that all-star that he was in his rookie year last year. I think they could go short-term, just a Blomqvist-Nedeljkovic duo. I was not very confident in that earlier in the summer, but the Penguins have a lot of confidence in Nedeljkovic. That's why they gave him a 2-year contract, and obviously they have confidence in Joel Blomqvist as well, because whenever they got to the trade deadline, they traded Magnus Hellberg. And I know a lot of people saw that deal and said, that's a nothing deal, whatever. They ended up getting a goaltender back that was an ECHL guy and Ludovic Weber, and he's already gone. He left the organization, but at the same time, they were still in a playoff race. They were still saying that they wanted to go for it in the playoffs. They sold off Gensel because that was the smart move to do, but they didn't really sell anything else off. They wanted the team to make the postseason, and if they did that, their number 3 was Joel Blomqvist. They had the faith in Blomqvist to be that number 3 because that's what Hellberg was brought in to do initially at the start of last season. So they had faith in him to be the number 3 last year. Something tells me they're going to have faith in him, especially if they get that sample size going through December and the early portion of January, where Tristan Jarry's trade value goes up. Maybe Joel Blomqvist's stock is rising as well. And all of a sudden you see a Blomqvist-Nedeljkovic pairing down the second half of next season. Let's finish off with a couple more questions here. Matthew Clark says, I'd like to see Bros and Howe get a bottom 6 role in this team. Tanner Howe is who you're referencing, obviously, second rounder this year. He's going to go back to the WHL. He signed his 3-year ELC, but I think it's going to get pushed. I think he's going to end up at 18 years old back at the WHL, and I think that you're going to see him for probably another year, maybe another 2, depending on how he does with Regina in his last year this year before he gets to the NHL level. Tristan Bros, again, another future type of piece. I don't think he's close to start the season. We'll see what he does once he starts to face professionals, but that's a large jump to make going from the college game to professional. He's got to make that jump at the American League level. He's got to get to the point at the AHL level to where they want to see him make the jump to the NHL. So I think both of those guys, Matthew, are a little far off, but I'm excited for both of them, especially Tanner Howe brings something that not a lot of prospects in the Penguin system have, and that's that grit, that's that sandpaper, that's that dirt bag type of quality. He's hard to play against. He loves the net front, and I'm excited to watch him when he goes back to Regina this year, but I just think that that's where he's going to end up. Kyle has a question here that says, how likely do you think it is that Poulin gets a real look at a roster spot? Sam Poulin had a lot of opportunities last year, but for similar reasons, he wasn't able to capitalize. Injuries and poor timing really hurt Sam Poulin last year. And they hurt him the year before as well. And obviously he took time off for mental health reasons, and that did have an effect on his timeline. But if you look at last year, Poulin could have come up on a couple of different occasions, but he was injured. And then when he did come up, plays in 3 NHL games, and then ends up with that illness that was tearing through the Penguins towards the end of the season. And by the time he was over that, the Penguins had already been winning, and they weren't going to change the formula. They wanted him to get some playing time. They didn't want him to just sit in the press box. So at that point, they sent him back down to the American Hockey League. I think he's going to get an opportunity. I do. I think that it's likely that going into camp, their desire is for Sam Poulin to earn a spot out of training camp. And again, the one big thing and the one big domino that has to fall is I do think there's a trade coming. And I think that outside of the in-season Tristan Jarry trade, the trade that's coming is one of the centers at the NHL level, whether that be Lars Eller or Nola Chari. I would think Eller has a higher upside and would garner a higher return. But I feel like one of those two guys are on their way out because Blake Lazat's a center as well. Vasily Ponomarev is a center as well. Sam Poulin is a center as well. So I feel like one of those roadblocks might be taken away from Sam Poulin, but I also think that he's going to be given a shot in training camp. And if he can do what he did last year in training camp, which was come in and he started at the prospect challenge in Buffalo last year. He was one of the better players for the Penguins in the prospect challenge, and he continued to impress throughout the majority of camp, fell off a little bit late, and then, of course, got injured early in the season for Wilkes-Barre, which stunted any momentum that he built throughout the summer. So I think if he can build that momentum again, he's certainly going to get opportunities. And 2 years ago, he played 3 games in the NHL. Last year, he played 3 games in the NHL. This year, he's going to get more than 3 games. He's going to be given that opportunity if he can stay healthy. Team Crusade wants to know, who would you not be surprised that won't be on the Penguins during training camp that don't get talked about? Sorry, let me read that through again. Who would I not be surprised about that isn't going to be on the Penguins during training camp that doesn't get talked about? Who would I not be surprised about? That's a tough one. I would not be surprised if Obviously, a lot of people are mentioning Jack St. Ivany. I think he's a lock to be sitting in that spot, pole position, as a certain Pittsburgh coach likes to say. He's going to be in that spot on the right side, third pairing. Philip Kral's an interesting name. He was brought in, 24-year-old, played over in Europe last year, was a Maple Leafs draft pick when Kyle Dubas was the general manager, actually was part of the first draft class with Kyle Dubas as general manager in Toronto. Left shot defenseman. I don't think Owen Pickering is going to be close to the NHL. They got another couple of young guys down there. I wouldn't be surprised, especially if John Ludwig is not ready to go at the start of the season, that Philip Kral battles it out with guys like Ryan Shea and Sebastian Aho to potentially make the opening night roster. But again, that's just based on the fact that we haven't seen all of these guys together on the ice. That's a name that I'm very intrigued to see about where the Penguins view him and how they view him going into this season. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Let's close it out with this one. Rags15061 says, didn't he just get a 5-year contract last year? Talking about Tristan Jarry. He did. And then he immediately did all the things that the Penguins were hoping he didn't do. And let's also not forget the fact that last year, the Penguins needed a starting goaltender. They were really only looking at Casey DeSmith in the organization going into the offseason. They wanted to get a starter. They wanted to be contenders again. They wanted to bounce back and be contenders that season. The best option available was Tristan Jarry, and that was the going rate. So they gave him a 5-year contract, and I feel like they gritted their teeth through it and said, this was the best option we had. This is the best we could do. We got Jarry. He's shown to potentially at his best be a very good goaltender, but at the same time, at his worst, we know what he is. And he ended up showing at his worst, which was the end of last season. He struggled from January 1st on, and then he lost his net, got sick, and was not able to get it back from Alex Nedeljkovic. So he did just get a 5-year contract last year, but a year changes a lot of things. And right now, the Pittsburgh Penguins are in need of a different goaltender. And Rags has a follow-up here and says, won't that make him tough to trade, though? It does, but again, look at the options out there. Some teams might want an upgraded goaltender like Utah, who does not have a very stellar goaltender. Their goaltenders are 900 type guys. And if Jarry does, as I mentioned at the start of the show, if Jarry does early this season what he was able to do early every season of his career, which is play stellar hockey from October to December, his stock's going to go up and somebody's going to take a risk on him. Somebody like a Utah Hockey Club who has not very much to lose going into next season because nobody's expecting them to be a playoff team. But if they're able to hang around in the Western Conference, which we saw last year, the last couple of spots in the Western Conference were kind of a crapshoot down in the late parts of the season. If they're able to hang around, the new owner seems like he's a little giddy to get his team into the postseason, and they might look for an upgrade in Tristan Jarry over a guy like Connor Ingram or a guy like, is it Connor Ingram? I don't remember if it's Connor Ingram, who's the backup out there, or a guy like Karel Vejmelka, who we talked about a little bit earlier. Zachary DeRosa, let's go to your question here, who says, do you think Columbus would be crazy enough to do a hockey trade between Graves and Laine? No, I don't think anybody is crazy enough to give a potential 40-goal scorer away, even though it seems like his time in Columbus is over. I don't think Don Waddell is going to give that away for Ryan Graves, who, to Rags' point, as of right now, why would anybody trade for Ryan Graves? 5 years left on that contract at $4+ million, coming off the worst season he has ever had as a professional. I do think he's going to bounce back, but I think the Penguins are really counting on it. And I don't think that anybody's crazy enough to make that trade. Patrick Laine, even at 2 years, 8.7, even though that cap hit is large and they don't feel like that he's going to play for them, I don't think they'd be crazy enough to pull the trigger on that. Although it would be something. It would be, the new Taylor Hall for Adam Larson. The deal was 1-for-1. That would be even crazier if it happened in that lens. The Columbus Blue Jackets and the Pittsburgh Penguins, two teams that are technically rivals. I mean, they're inter-division rivals. I wouldn't call them rivals per se, but they're teams that have to battle with each other. And you would think the Columbus Blue Jackets aren't going to take a defenseman coming off his worst season for a guy that has the potential of a 40-goal scorer and just needs a fresh start. So in a dreamland, it'd be nice. And you did say it is CBJ, which I get it. But at the same time, it might be a new era in CBJ. Don Waddell did a pretty good job down there in Carolina. We'll see if he can carry that over when he gets up to the Blue Jackets. Pittsburgh Heather, welcome back to the stream. Heather says, could the Penguins trade Eller for some picks and then put Hayes at third line center and choose between Ponomarev, Koppinen, and Koivunen for fourth line center? I think that Eller for some picks is something that is 100% on the table for the Pittsburgh Penguins this year. I think that, Eller was great for the Pens last year, one of the most consistent third line centers that they have had in several years. But I think for that very reason, and for the reason that he's on a contract year, he might be enticing to a lot of teams, especially a guy that has a Stanley Cup ring. That always adds a little bit of intrigue around the league. So I could 100% see the Penguins looking to offload Eller or floating Eller out there for some draft capital, especially for how hungry Kyle Dubas is for that draft capital right now. I think Hayes starts the season at third line center regardless, though. We've mentioned it a couple times, talked about Kevin Hayes yesterday on Tip of the Ice-Burgh, the full podcast version of it. And I think Hayes starts at third line center. And I think if Eller's not traded, he bumps down to 4C. And you're looking at Crosby, Malkin, Hayes, Eller straight down the middle, moving Achari over to the right side. And if it is vacant, if Eller moves on and there is a vacancy at 4C, Ponomarev, Koppinen, Koivunen. First of all, Koivunen is a winger, so he wouldn't be a center for fourth line center. I think Blake Lizotte is a name that could 100% be thrown in there. I think Sam Poulin is a name that could 100% be thrown in there, but I do think that there are plenty of options that the Penguins have to go 4C at that point. And if none of those guys are ready, because remember, a lot of these guys don't have NHL experience, or at least any more than a cup of coffee. Ponomarev has, I think, 1 game or 2 games. Koivunen doesn't have any games. Koppinen had a couple of games for the Penguins last season. They can always put Achari back there. It's not the best scenario. It's not the best answer, but it's an answer anyway. Couple more questions that just came in. Let's go with Matthew Clark's to start. If Jarry does get traded to Utah, what does the package look like, or what prospects or players would you want? I think the first thing they would look for, as I bring up Utah's page here, the first thing they would look for is the draft picks, because Utah has a lot of prospects that they have plans for. So I think they'd be looking to get some of those draft picks. And let me look here at which draft picks they have available. Not only do they have $9 million in salary cap space, close to $10 million still, with 23 active roster and 45 contracts on the books. They have multiple third-round picks next year. I could see that being included. I don't think the Penguins are getting a first-round pick. That would be wild if they did. But I could see a third-round pick next year. 2026, they have 3 second-round picks. I could see the Penguins targeting one of those picks as well. As far as looking at their prospects, which I think they're going to be a little bit less open to parting with. I mean, I do love me some TJ Ginla, but they just drafted him, and there's no way they're going to trade him. Certainly not at this point. I think it's probably going to be a draft pick. If I'm looking at this, I think it's going to be strictly a draft pick trade. And I want a second and a third if you're desperate. If not, the other big piece of this is if the Penguins can get it without retained salary, that's huge for them. They open up $5+ million for the next 4 years, I believe, for Tristan Jarry. That's a huge asset for a team that's rebuilding, because that allows them to do more things like what they did with Kevin Hayes. Take on a contract, take on some salary, get a draft pick in return. And they did it with Hayes. And listen, say what you will about Kevin Hayes. He had a down season last year. It's not the worst piece in the world if he can bounce back. If he can be what he was in his last year in Philadelphia on the ice, then it could be something good for some of these young wingers that the Penguins have coming up, and they're going to give them some opportunities. Any other questions? Let me scroll down through here. Gordon says, what are they going to get for Jarry? A bag of pucks. Dude can't stop a beach ball. He can from October to December. So that's going to be your window there. October to December, and maybe he pushes it into January. So we'll have to wait and see. It all depends, of course, on where the trade market is at. What teams are desperate for goaltenders? What teams are all of a sudden looking like they could contend for a playoff spot, despite the fact that coming into the year, they didn't expect to, and they didn't have a goaltender of today. Tristan Jarry could potentially be an upgrade for teams in that aspect, and that's why I think Utah has come up so many different times. Peter Swisstock says, any Penguins with 30+ goal potential? Certainly. Certainly they have players that have 30+ goal potential. One, Sidney Crosby, scored over 40 last year. Evgeny Malkin, I think this year going into it, I could see him potentially pushing for 30 again because I see him having a better year with some better line mates, including Michael Bunting, who I saw is in a question here in a little bit as well. So I think those two for certain. And of course, those are the obvious names. Brian Rust last year was a 30 goal scorer. He played as a 30 goal scorer. If he's healthy, he does it. And I think that same thing goes for this year. And I think that might be it as of right now. I was going to say Bunting, but I don't know if I'd go that far with Michael Bunting. I think he's going to have a pretty good season for the Penguins. I don't know if I'd go as far to say 30 goal scorer unless they put him in the front on the power play and David Quinn and Erik Karlsson and, Sidney Crosby works some magic and that power play looks like it was supposed to look last year. And, Bunting ends up being the net front presence that just puts away a bunch of garbage goals and scores a bunch of goals off his shin pad, then maybe. But I think if you're looking at which players have 30 goal potential in 2024-25, it's down to those three: Crosby, Malkin, and Brian Rust. Speaking of Brian has a question about Michael Bunting, saying Bunting filled a huge hole as a net front presence guy. Do any of the other additions add that specific aspect? No. They really don't. I mean, Beauvillier is not a net front guy. Blake Lizotte, not really. He is a guy that I think you're going to see as more of a Brandon Tanev guy. Tanev wasn't really let me sit in the net front type of guy. He was antagonistic. He was good on the forecheck, but he wasn't necessarily that Patrick Hornqvist, I'm going to stand the net front and just be in the way. So Lizotte, not really, but can give you a little bit more of what characteristics you're looking for. It's really Michael Bunting. It's Michael Bunting, and it's something I'd like to see Sam Poulin add to his game, and it's something that I think Drew O'Connor is trying to add to his game as well. I mean, he talked at the end of last season. I think it was huge for him to see what Michael Bunting unlocked for a player like Evgeny Malkin late last year, and I think Drew O'Connor going into this offseason knew, hey, I need to be a little bit more physical. I need to be a little bit better at finishing in the net front. And I think that's one thing I want to see from him this year as well. So Bunting is the main guy, but I could see O'Connor potentially building towards that. Same with Poulin, and Lizotte's going to be not quite like that, but Lizotte's going to be somebody that I think a lot of Penguins fans like. Karen says, why not go back for Jared McCann in Seattle? Seattle's not going to trade Jared McCann. He's one of their best players. They're a team that going into the season with the new head coach, they're hoping to bounce back to what they were a couple of seasons ago when they were a playoff team, when they were knocking off the defending Stanley Cup champion Colorado Avalanche in the first round. They're not going to put Jared McCann on the trade block unless, of course, everything goes wrong once again. But I still don't think that McCann would end up on the chopping block if that ends up being the case. Pittsburgh Heather says, what would a package look like for Ehlers and McGroarty? It starts with a first-round pick. It probably includes one of your top prospects. Maybe, again, I don't think I'm willing to trade Yeager, and I think Kyle Dubas is along the same lines there. I don't think he should be willing to trade Braden Yeager, but it's probably one of your top prospects, such as a guy like, it's tough. I don't want to say one of the goalie guys because I like him, but that might have to be what they go for. And it might have to be a guy like Murashev. It might have to be a guy like Owen Pickering. It might have to be a guy. I don't think they trade away somebody they just drafted. So I don't think it'd be Harrison Brunick. I don't think it'd be Tanner Howe, but it's got to be one of their top prospects and probably more draft capital as well, because you're getting, Nikolai Ehlers is a bona fide top line winger. Rutger McGroarty is a top 20 prospect across the entire NHL. So you're giving away a first, potentially maybe 2 first-round picks. And I don't know if that ends up being worth it unless it gets to the point where the Winnipeg Jets just need to offload it, which, again, I don't think that they're going to get to that point. So as I kick my entire table, I'm going to say it's going to be expensive. It starts with a first and probably one of their top 5 prospects in the Penguins. It might take another top 10 prospect, another first or a second at some point in the future, but it's going to take a lot to get that package for Ehlers and McGroarty. It'd be a dream because you're bringing in immediately your top prospect. McGroarty and Yeager can try to take you into the future, and you bring in a guy, Nikolai Ehlers, who has plenty of run left on the tires for him, and he helps the team this year. So perfect situation if you can pull it off, but the price is going to be very steep, Heather. Dabton says, if Poulin doesn't make the NHL lineup and is a mainstay, is it time to move on from him? This is a massive year for Sam Poulin, as I'm looking at some of these other questions real quick. But it's a massive year for Sam Poulin. I put him yesterday when I revealed my top 10 prospects list, him at number 8. This is the last year that he's a prospect, right? This is the year, in my eyes, that he goes from being a prospect to just what he is. And what does that become? Like, what ends up being the answer to the second half of that statement? Is he an NHL bottom 6 guy? Is he a fourth liner? Is he a healthy scratch every game type of guy? Or is he an AHL player that can occasionally come up to the NHL? I think he has the potential to become that NHL mainstay, maybe have a similar season to what Valtteri Puustinen had, but maybe a bottom 6 role and not that middle 6 winger role. It's a big year for him. You know, it's kind of a crap or get off the pot situation for Sam Poulin. I don't know if it would be time to necessarily move on from him, but certainly you're turning your focus and you're turning your attention on the other prospects in the system, because at that point he would have aged out. He would have had opportunities and he just hadn't been able to put them all together. And you have to move on at that point. I mean, whether that's via trade, whether that's he becomes an AHL guy that looks for a shot and spot starts here and there. But it is a massive year for Sam Poulin going into this year. And it's going to tell you a lot about what his future holds in the Penguins organization based on what he can do. And I think the biggest thing for him is stay healthy. Because when he was healthy last year, he was good. You know, a lot of people are forgetting how solid him and Jesse Puljujärvi looked together for that 3-week, 4-week stretch at the American Hockey League. And also, I thought Poulin looked pretty good when he played at the National League level last year for his 3 games. He's obviously going to need a little bit more run. He's going to need to stay healthy throughout an entire season. Those are going to be 2 of the biggest things. But if he can put it all together, I have faith that he could become a mainstay, as it were, not a guy that's, you know, shuffling back between the A and the N. But I think it is a huge year for him. And if he doesn't make it, a lot of the focus starts to get taken away from him and put on some of these other guys like the Tristan Broses, who is making his, you know, professional debut this year. Guys like, you know, Owen Pickering, guys like Koivunen, Ponomarev, and then of course Jaeger coming down the pike. Potentially, you know, likely scenario that he starts in Moose Jaw, but he's a guy that they're going to look at for a very extensive time in training camp here in a couple months. Acro says Puustinen Sid Rust first line. Then he threw down a lot here. O'Connor, Malkin, Bunting second line. Puustinen's interesting on the first line. The problem with that is Pusti, I believe, let me double check. He played on the right a lot last year, but is he a natural lefty? Valtteri Puustinen, bring it up here. Sorry, this is horrible for content. He is a righty, so he's a right winger. So is Brian Rust. So I don't know if that necessarily would work. O'Connor, Malkin, Bunting on the second line. Same thing. Bunting and O'Connor both on the left side. So as much as I like Valtteri Puustinen, I think that, you know, he has the skill set to play, especially if he's playing with a center like a Sidney Crosby or an Evgeny Malkin. He has the skill set to be able to play and score goals at that level. But I do think that he's starting the season battling for a bottom 6 position. Because the way I see it as of right now is unnamed acquired piece on the left side for Sidney Crosby. I still think that they're going to look to go out and get somebody for that role. Sidney Crosby, Brian Rust, then Michael Bunting, Evgeny Malkin, and Rickard Rakell on the second line. That was your second line to end last year. Rakell started coming around. Obviously, we've talked in this episode about how good Michael Bunting was for Evgeny Malkin. So I think that's where you start the season if you're the Pittsburgh Penguins with your second line. Mac Brunson says, why not trade Jarry and Rakell for Vetrano and picks? Simply because I don't think that trade goes through. I don't think, who is Vetrano even on right now? Frankie Vetrano's on the Ducks, I believe, unless he got traded. He is a member of the Anaheim Ducks. First of all, I don't know if they'd be interested in bringing back Rickard Rakell. Secondly, I just don't think that the Anaheim Ducks are going to be interested in acquiring Jarry and Raquel for Vetrano and picks when they still already have John Gibson. That's a similar situation to the Penguins. When you talk about, oh, who could the Penguins go out and get in net? That conversation has to start with, well, they have Jarry. Something has to give there first. Something would have to give in Anaheim with John Gibson for them to want to trade for Tristan Jarry. So I don't see that happening. Frankie Vetrano would be a nice piece for the Penguins this year. But at the same time, I don't see the Anaheim Ducks wanting to pull the trigger on that move. Dante has a question here that says, who is your pick for most improved Penguin? That's a tough one because I think Ryan Graves could be put in this category because, I mean, he performed so poorly last year. The bar is set so low that even if he returns to what he's already been in the NHL, he's going to be massively improved from year 1 to year 2 with the Penguins. So Ryan Graves is in that category. I would say Drew O'Connor's in that category because you saw last year that he started the year in a good spot, but still the spot that he was in at the beginning of the year and the spot that he was in at the end of the year was such a drastic change. He had so much growth throughout last season, and I think he's going to take that, transfer that into this season, and I think you can see him continue to make another jump this year for the Pittsburgh Penguins, which would be huge, especially if they can get him in a much better situation, which I understand. It's a great situation playing alongside Sidney Crosby, but for his skill level, if he can go up against other third liners, he's going to do absolutely crazy things for the Penguins in the bottom 6. So I would say, as of right now, the two names that spring to mind immediately are Ryan Graves and Drew O'Connor in those ones. Let's see. Any other questions here? Jim says, Jaeger, Sid, Rust. I'd love that. I don't know if that's likely because, again, Braden Jaeger is going to have to come in and do some crazy, crazy things. He is the golden goose for the Penguins. Now, I understand that, a golden goose with the potential to be a second-line center at best right now, which is where I think his current projection is not phenomenal, but that's where we're at with the Penguins prospect pool. But Jaeger is going to be interesting. I think Jaeger in training camp is going to have a lot of eyes on him. I think that Mike Sullivan's going to do the thing, and he's going to put Jaeger with Sid early in camp just to put him with Sid. We've seen that happen in years past. Puustinen 2 years ago played with Sidney Crosby in the first couple of weeks of training camp, and everybody said, wow, is Valtteri Puustinen about to make this team out of the camp? And no, it was just learn from Sid, see how he operates. I could see the same thing happening with Braden Jaeger, but of course, he might make it hard on him. He might make it hard on him. I don't know what decision they're going to make. I don't know where they're leaning, but I would say the most likely scenario is him back to the WHL for a year. But man, is it going to be fun to watch him in training camp again with everything that he was able to do and build throughout last season in juniors. 1 to 100 from Jean-Claude Von Don says 1 to 100, 100 being an AHL Calder Cup champion. How close is Wilkes to competing for the Calder? That's a tough one. They they made it to the playoffs a couple of years ago, but they got back to the playoffs last year. They were a team to be reckoned with last year. And I think this year it's going to be, they got a lot of talent down there. They switched over a lot of things, including the coaching staff. I think this year you're looking at a similar situation for them going into the year. That's where I'm at, because a lot of these guys, none of them practically have played together. You got a lot of guys making professional debuts, playing a full professional schedule for the first time, like Bros, like Pickering. The goaltending situation is going to be interesting. Do they end up losing Joel Blomqvist at some time this season? Do they get Sergei Murashov to start the season? Is he going to come over, or is he going to go back to Russia? There's a lot of factors at play here, but I think that's going to be a very young team in Wilkes-Barre. And typically, they're not, younger teams in the AHL are not considered Calder Cup favorites, especially with how good the Hershey Bears are, the back-to-back champs down there. So 1 to 100, since you phrased it that way, I'll give them 60. I'll give them 60. I think they have a chance to be a playoff team once again this year. I think it depends on how quickly a lot of these young guys mesh, how quickly a lot of these young guys are able to assimilate to the professional game. And I think that's going to be an important aspect as to what we see them do as far as AHL success this season. So I'll say 60. Penziel says, Jesperi Kotkaniemi. I mean, let me look up what his current situation is. Jesperi Kotkaniemi is currently, dang, internet is slow today. He's with the Carolina Hurricanes. He's a guy that last couple of years has had some varying degrees of success in Carolina. I don't know if he's necessarily an option for the Penguins because I'm not sure that Carolina Hurricanes are looking to trade him. But if they are, Pens are looking to get younger. I just don't know where he would fit on the current roster. And I also don't know about bringing in guys that are going to become roadblocks for the guys in the organization. You know, your Koi Vunins, who could be a middle six guy this year. Your Ponomarevs, who could become a decent scoring option in the bottom six this year. You know, I think you want to see what you have in some of those options this year. And I think that's why you saw a lot of 1-year deals or 2-year deals signed by Kyle Dubas this offseason, mainly 1-year deals, unless it's Blake Lizotte, because those guys at that point, if you want to get rid of them, it's easier to offload them, and it's also easier to bury them. Thomas Gable says, or Gamble, excuse me, my apologies, as we're only going to answer a couple more here. Let me just sign those couple more we're going to answer, and then that is going to be it for today. Let's start with Thomas's, who says, what if Gino moves up to the top line winger? Look at what the Oilers did. The Oilers did that with Draisaitl and McDavid because they literally had no other options. And I get it. Now the Penguins don't have very many other options, but still the best bet for the Penguins is going to be to keep Gino as a second line center because we've seen what they had to do whenever everything was on Sid and Gino the last 2 years, and that was not playing together. It was all on them to score, all on them and Erik Karlsson and Chris Letang, and it just wasn't good enough. You need to spread your scoring out. So I don't like the idea of, for an extended period of time, putting Gino on Sid's wing. Not only that, Gino, production-wise, was still one of the top 7 second-line centers in the league last year, and I think that you're fine with him at second-line center going into this year again. Let's answer Chicken a la King. Nice name. Says, has Vellucci been re-signed? Vellucci was under contract. So Vellucci is still, Mike Vellucci, that is still with the Pittsburgh Penguins. He will still be coaching the offense. The forwards. He'll still be coaching the penalty kill as of, the last time we heard. So Vellucci is still a member of the Penguins coaching staff. Railfan Matthew says, do you think the Penguins have a shot at getting McGroarty? We talked about McGroarty a little bit earlier, but we'll touch on it here. And who do you think they'll go after if they want a top 6 guy playing with Sid? I think, again, Rutger McGroarty would be a fantastic piece for the Pittsburgh Penguins. He's going to be a costly piece for the Pittsburgh Penguins. It's going to be a first rounder, might be another top prospect. It's going to be a pretty hefty price, especially if you include Lars Eller, which goes to the second part of your question there, Matthew, is, Nikolai Ehlers is an interesting name there. And Nikolai Ehlers is a name that everybody wants to see. Every team that needs a top winger right now is zeroing in on Ehlers, zeroing in on Laine, zeroing in on Zegras. I think that of the 3, they would be able to get probably Laine. But again, all of these deals, you're giving something up, and it kind of goes against what Kyle Dubas has done all offseason. Certainly not the earlier trade that we talked about with Laine, which was Laine for Graves straight up. But I think of those 3, Laine is the most realistic. The one that I want the most is Nikolai Ehlers, but that's just blind hope, blind optimism that they bring in the best candidate. And to me, that's Ehlers. And again, I'm not sure what's going on with Zegras because he's on the trade block down there, but he's still a very talented young player on a team of very talented young forwards. So what do they end up doing with him? Who do they want to trade him to? And what's the price going to be? Because the Ducks don't have to trade Trevor Zegras. They don't have to. And if they don't have to, and they don't get the offer that they want, they probably won't. Last question we're going to answer, and then we're going to say goodbye for the day, is from Justej Benapal. Sorry if I butchered your name. But says, what do you think Owen Pickering's ceiling is in the NHL? Do I have an NHL comparable? I don't currently have an NHL comparable. What I think his ceiling is a top 4 guy. Mainly a second pairing guy, but a guy that can play top 4 minutes, a guy that's going to be pretty good for you on the penalty kill. That's just where I think he's at coming out of juniors. Again, you have to see him fill out. He said that he gained another 20 pounds this offseason, which has been a nice, storyline to watch as he continues to put on weight. He continues to get a little bit bigger. I think he's 6'4", 6'5" at this point, closing in on 200 pounds. As he's starting to fill out and become a little bit bigger, I'm intrigued to see how it transfers with playing the professional game. There were a lot of people, including friend of the show, Jeff Taylor, that told me he kind of got pushed around at player development camp a couple of times, and it's not a great sign for a guy, but he's still young. So I'm intrigued to see what he does, what lessons he learns, and how he adapts to the professional game this year. But I still think his ceiling is to be maybe a second pairing guy in the NHL. And I mean, you look at the Penguins, their second pairing guys right now are, Grzelcyk, who's been that in the past. He's been a top pairing guy, and I would put Chris Letang there as well. Not that Pickering's ever going to have the offensive capabilities of Chris Letang. I don't think that's within the realm of what I would look for him to do. But I do think that he's a top 4 guy if he reaches that peak and he reaches that ceiling. So again, first professional year, let's see what he's able to do. But that's going to do it for this episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. We will see you guys tomorrow for another full episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Have a couple of good topics in store for you with me and my co-host, Nick Horwat. But remember, you can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh or anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.